It didn't start with a press conference. There was no breaking news banner, no insider tweet, no official statement. It started with silence. The kind of silence that only exists when something massive has already happened behind closed doors, and the people involved aren't ready for the world to know yet. Inside a private conversation, one never meant to leave the room, a decision was made that would quietly send shockwaves through the entire foundation of women's basketball. For nearly a decade, Aya Wilson wasn't just part of the system, she was the system. Franchises were built around her. Championships were expected because of her. Awards followed her like shadows. MVPs, finals MVPs, defensive dominance that made even elite scorers hesitate before stepping into the paint. There are great players, and then there are players who define eras. Aya Wilson defined an era, which is exactly why what happened next felt impossible. Because when the internal discussions for the next USA roster began, something shifted. Not publicly, not loudly, but unmistakably. For the first time in years, her name didn't carry the same automatic certainty. It lingered. It was debated. And then it was left off. No injury. No scheduled rest announcement. No farewell narrative. Just a decision. And in the vacuum that decision created, another name didn't just appear. It took over. Caitlin Clark. But this isn't where the story begins. To understand the tension, the emotion, the underlying fracture that led to this moment, you have to go back to when everything still looked perfect on the surface. Back to a time when Aya Wilson stood alone at the top. She had everything. Dominance. Respect. Control. The league moved with her rhythm. The spotlight followed her every move. And there was no real challenge to her position as the face of the game. Until suddenly, there was. Caitlin Clark didn't rise through the ranks quietly. She didn't wait for approval. She didn't ease into the spotlight. She detonated into it. Overnight, arenas weren't just filling, they were selling out weeks in advance. Television ratings didn't just improve, they shattered expectations the league had been chasing for years. Highlight reels across every major network became impossible to watch without seeing her logo rain shots. And just like that, the conversation changed. Not gradually. Instantly. The same analysts who once spoke in absolutes about dominance started using new words: impact, influence, reach. And whether anyone wanted to admit it or not, those words were now being attached to Caitlin Clark. That's where the shift became personal. Because for a player like Aya Wilson, who had earned everything the hard way, the sudden explosion of attention around someone new didn't feel like growth. It felt like displacement. At first, it was subtle. A post here, a comment there, carefully worded phrases about sustained excellence and real impact. Nothing direct, but nothing accidental either. The timing always lined up. The message always landed. And people noticed. Because in modern sports, perception spreads faster than truth. Every reaction became a headline. Every silence became a statement. Every moment became part of a larger narrative, whether it was intended or not. And here's where the real twist begins. Because while fans argued, while media debated, while narratives spiraled out of control, USA Basketball was watching. Quietly. Carefully. Not just the performances on the court, but everything around it. The reactions. The energy. The chemistry implications. Because international basketball isn't just about talent. It's about translation. And behind closed doors, a difficult question started to take shape. Which style of dominance actually works on the global stage? Aya Wilson's game had always thrived within the structure of the WNBA, physical, powerful, and incredibly effective within that system. But international play? That's a different world. Different officiating. Different spacing. Different tolerance for contact. The kind of plays that draw whistles domestically often disappear entirely overseas. And when those whistles disappear, everything changes. At the same time, Caitlin Clark's game didn't rely on that system. Her range couldn't be officiated away. Her shot creation didn't depend on calls. Her playmaking didn't pause for contact. It translated. Anywhere. Against anyone. And when she finally stepped onto the international stage, she didn't adjust. She dominated. Effortlessly. That's when the decision stopped being emotional and became strategic. When the final roster was assembled, it told a story without saying a word. New energy, new faces, a clear shift toward the future. And one name, once considered untouchable, was missing. Aya Wilson. But the biggest shock wasn't the omission itself. It was what followed. Because according to insiders, the reaction behind the scenes wasn't quiet. It wasn't reflective. It was explosive. Calls were made. Questions were demanded. Explanations were expected. For someone who had spent years as the unquestioned centerpiece, the sudden realization that the game could move forward without her hit differently. And in the middle of that storm, one narrative began to form. Not confirmed, not official, but powerful enough to spread anyway. That this wasn't just about basketball. That somehow, some way, Caitlin Clark had become part of the reason. Whether that's reality or just perception shaped by a changing era is the question no one has been able to answer. But one thing is undeniable. This moment isn't just about a roster. It's about a shift in power, a shift in attention, a shift in what the future of the game looks like. Because when dominance meets disruption, only one can define what comes next. While the noise was growing louder, while speculation, whispers, and narratives were spinning out of control, in San Juan something very different was happening. Caitlin Clark wasn't responding. She wasn't posting. She wasn't reacting. She wasn't feeding the headlines. She was playing, and not just playing, commanding. Because while the conversation back home was filled with tension, questions, and controversy, on the court, everything looked simple, precise, controlled, undeniable. Possession after possession, game after game, Clark did what very few players in the world are capable of doing. She slowed the chaos down and bent it to her will. And the results? Impossible to ignore. Team USA didn't just win. They dominated. 5 games. 5 wins. An average margin so wide it stopped feeling competitive and started feeling inevitable. And at the center of it all was Clark. Not forcing the moment. Not chasing it. Owning it. She led the tournament in assists, controlling the rhythm of every game like a veteran who had been in that system for years. Her shooting was efficient, her decision-making surgical, her presence stabilizing. And that's what changed everything. Because this wasn't hype anymore. This wasn't projection. This wasn't media narrative. This was proof. On an international stage, under a different set of rules, a different pace, a different kind of pressure, Clark's game didn't shrink. It expanded. And when the tournament reached its final moments, when everything settled and the performances were evaluated, the decision was unanimous. MVP. Not as a gesture, not as a storyline, but as recognition. She had been the best player on the floor, on a roster filled with elite talent. And that's where the contrast became impossible to ignore. Because while Clark was building something undeniable in silence back home, the response from Aya Wilson's side started to take shape. Carefully worded explanations. Talk of scheduling conflicts. Subtle attempts to reshape the narrative. But it didn't land, because the timing didn't match the reality. And in sports, when the performance is this clear, explanations start to sound like excuses. The difference between the two reactions told its own story. Clark. Quiet, focused, grateful. Wilson. Frustrated, questioned, unsettled. And whether that perception was entirely fair or not, it spread fast. But here's where the story deepens. Because international basketball isn't just about skill. It's about control under pressure. Hostile crowds. Unfamiliar environments. Officials who don't care about reputations or resumes. Every possession becomes a test, not just of talent, but of composure. And that's what Team USA evaluates more than anything. Not who scores the most, but who holds everything together when the moment starts to crack. Because history has shown them something very important. One player, no matter how talented, can disrupt everything if the chemistry breaks. And chemistry is fragile. It doesn't show up on stat sheets, but it decides championships. So when selectors looked at the future, they weren't just asking, who is the best player? They were asking, who makes everyone else better under pressure? And in San Juan, Clark answered that question over and over again. Not with words, with decisions. The way she moved the ball. The way she created space. The way she elevated the players around her. It wasn't about dominance. It was about orchestration. And something else started forming, something even more important. Connection. With players like Angel Reese and Paige Buchers, there was a visible chemistry that couldn't be manufactured. It came from shared battles, mutual respect, understanding each other's games at a level that doesn't require explanation. There was no hierarchy, no tension, no silent competition for control, just flow. The kind of flow that turns a group of talented individuals into a team that feels inevitable. And that's what made this moment bigger than just one roster decision. Because what was being built looked like the future. A system based on pace, spacing, intelligence, and trust. Not reputation. Not legacy. Execution. And as that system started to take shape, another reality quietly emerged. The game itself was changing. Not slowly. Rapidly. The audience was expanding. The attention was growing. The expectations were evolving. And players who could pull new eyes into the sport, who could make people care, suddenly carried a different kind of value. Not instead of performance, but alongside it. And that's where the gap widened. Because while Aya Wilson represented everything the league had been, Caitlin Clark started to represent everything it was becoming. One built the foundation. The other expanded the reach. And in a sport fighting for global attention, that distinction matters more than ever. By the time the tournament ended, with Team USA closing it out in dominant fashion, the message was clear. Not announced, not declared, but understood. The future wasn't waiting. It had already arrived. And it didn't ask for permission. It took its place. Now, the focus shifts forward. To Berlin. To the next World Cup stage. To Los Angeles, where the Olympic spotlight will be brighter than ever. And the question isn't whether talent will decide those moments. It always does. The question is, which version of the game will define them? The one built on legacy, or the one driven by evolution? Because power in sports doesn't disappear. It moves. Quietly. Decisively. And by the time the world reacts, it's already somewhere else. By the time the plane left San Juan, the results were already locked in. Not just on the scoreboard, but in the minds of the people who matter most. Because what Team USA witnessed over those games wasn't just dominance, it was direction. A blueprint. A glimpse into what the next era of women's basketball could look like when everything clicks at once. And once you see that kind of clarity, you don't unsee it. You build around it. Quietly. Deliberately. And sometimes ruthlessly, because the hardest decisions in sports are never about talent. They're about timing. And timing has a way of turning legends into questions faster than anyone expects. For Aya Wilson, the timing couldn't feel worse. Not because her ability disappeared. Not because her resume suddenly meant less. But because the game around her started moving in a direction that didn't need to wait anymore. That's the part fans struggle to accept. Greatness doesn't decline overnight, but relevance? That can shift in a moment. And moments like this don't come with warnings. They come with silence, with decisions made behind closed doors, with conversations that never become public, with conclusions reached long before the announcement ever arrives. And by the time those decisions surface, they feel sudden, but they're not. They're the result of something building for months, sometimes years. And in this case, everything pointed to one undeniable truth. The system was evolving. Faster pace, wider spacing, positionless movement, decision-making over isolation. A style that demands players who can think as quickly as they act. And more importantly, players who can make everyone else better in real time. That's where Caitlin Clark changed the equation completely. Because her impact wasn't just statistical. It was structural. She didn't just fit into the system. She became the system. Every pass created opportunity. Every possession carried intention. Every decision elevated the group instead of isolating the individual. And that kind of influence is impossible to ignore. Especially at the international level, where margins are smaller, pressure is heavier, and chemistry decides everything. But here's the twist most people still aren't fully seeing. This isn't just about Clark replacing someone. It's about the definition of leadership itself changing. For years, leadership looked like dominance. The best player takes control. The offense runs through them. The game bends to their will. And that model worked. It produced championships. It built dynasties.
But now,
leadership looks different. It looks like flow. It looks like trust. It looks like giving up control to gain something bigger. And that's not easy, especially for players who have spent their entire careers being the center of everything. Which is why this transition feels uncomfortable. Not just for players, for fans, for media, for the entire culture around the sport. Because when the face of the game changes, everything connected to it changes too. Narratives shift, priorities evolve, expectations reset, and suddenly, conversations that once felt settled are wide open again. That's where the tension lives now. Not in one roster decision, but in what that decision represents. Because if someone like Aya Wilson, a generational talent, a proven champion, a cornerstone of the sport, can find herself on the outside of a moment like this, then no position is permanent. No legacy is untouchable. And no player, no matter how dominant, can assume the future will automatically belong to them. That realization changes everything. It forces adaptation. It demands evolution. Or it creates resistance. And resistance, in a moment of transition, can be dangerous. Because the game doesn't slow down for anyone. It keeps moving. Forward. Always forward. Meanwhile, on the other side of that shift, Caitlin Clark isn't chasing anything. She's not trying to take a throne. She's not trying to prove a point. She's just playing. And in doing that, she's redefining what the throne even is. Not a position of control, but a position of connection. Not dominance over teammates, but elevation of them. And that's why this moment feels bigger than sports. Because it reflects something universal. The transition from one era to another is never clean. It's messy. It's emotional. It's filled with narratives that blur truth and perception. But at its core, it's inevitable. And once it begins, it doesn't stop halfway. It carries forward. Into Berlin, where the next global stage will test whether this new identity can hold under even greater pressure. Into Los Angeles, where the Olympic spotlight will magnify every decision, every performance, every weakness, every strength. And into a future where the game will look familiar, but feel completely different. Because by then, the shift won't be questioned anymore. It will be accepted. And the players who adapted early, they'll define it. The ones who didn't, they'll be remembered for what came before, not what came next. That's the reality of evolution in sports. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for comfort. And it doesn't guarantee space for everyone. So now, everything comes down to one final question. When the next roster is announced, when the next global stage begins, when the pressure reaches its peak, will this moment be remembered as a controversial decision? Or the exact moment the future quietly took over? Because one thing is already clear. The shift has started. And it's not going back. The scariest part about power is not when it's taken. It's when it quietly stops being needed. No announcement. No confrontation. No dramatic ending. Just a shift. And by the time you feel it, it's already gone. That's exactly where this story reaches its breaking point. Because what happened after San Juan didn't come with headlines strong enough to explain it. It came with something far more dangerous. Clarity. Inside USA basketball, the conversations changed. Not emotionally. Not reactively.
strategically.
They weren't asking who deserves it anymore. They were asking something colder. Something more final. What version of this team gives us the highest chance to dominate the future? And once that question replaces everything else, legacy becomes secondary. Even for someone like Aya Wilson. Because here's the truth that rarely gets said out loud. Dominance in one era doesn't guarantee relevance in the next. And that's not an insult. It's evolution. For years, Wilson represented certainty. You could rely on her production. You could build around her presence. You could trust that when the moment got heavy, she would deliver. But international basketball doesn't reward certainty. It rewards adaptability, speed of thought, versatility. decision-making under chaos. And in San Juan, a different kind of control took over. The kind that doesn't demand the ball. The kind that doesn't slow the game down to prove dominance. The kind that accelerates everything and somehow makes it look effortless. That's where Caitlin Clark separated herself. Not because she replaced anyone, but because she changed the requirements. Suddenly, the question wasn't, who is the most dominant player? It became, who makes this entire system unstoppable? And that's a completely different evaluation. Because systems don't revolve around individuals. They amplify the ones who connect everything together. That's what Clark became. A connector. A multiplier. A player whose presence didn't just add value, it transformed it. And once that becomes visible at the highest level, it's almost impossible to justify going backwards. That's the part people don't want to accept. Because emotionally it feels wrong. How do you move forward without someone who gave the game so much? How do you shift away from a player who defined winning for years? But sports has never been about fairness. It's about timing. And timing doesn't care about resumes. It cares about what comes next. That's where this story takes its sharpest turn. Because behind the scenes, this wasn't just about performance anymore. It became about alignment, energy,
Chemistry.
direction, and whether a player, no matter how great, fit into what the team was becoming, not what it used to be. And in that evaluation, something didn't match. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to create doubt. Enough to delay certainty. Enough to open the door. And once that door opens, someone else walks through it.
Confidently. Calmly.
Without asking. That's exactly what happened. Because while all of this was unfolding, Caitlin Clark wasn't reacting to the shift. She was driving it. Every possession she controlled added weight to the decision-maker's thinking. Every assist, every read, every moment of composure under pressure reinforced the same idea. This works. Not theoretically. Not hypothetically.
Right now.
And that's what makes a shift irreversible.
Proof.
Once you have it, you don't go back to uncertainty. You move forward with conviction, even if that means leaving something or someone behind. And that's where this stops being a basketball story. Because now it's about identity. What does Team USA want to represent? Power through dominance? Or power through cohesion? Isolation brilliance? Or collective execution? Because those two paths don't always lead to the same place. And choosing one means letting go of the other. That's the real decision that was made. Not just a roster cut. A philosophical shift. One that will define everything that comes next. Berlin. Los Angeles. Every international stage from this point forward. And here's the part that lingers the most. This might not be permanent. Great players adapt. Legends respond. And if there's one thing history has